Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly, and voila! You get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. Like always, I try and find interesting and fascinating people inside and outside the world of HR to bring you some insight as to what's going on in the world of HR data and analytics. Today, we have Mark Stelzner from IAHR Consulting, or Inflexion Advisors, right, Mark?
Yeah, that's why we changed it to IA, because no one can pronounce inflection, right? So
Inflection, sorry, there you go. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you. We also have Dwight Brown from Turetsky Consulting. Hey, Dwight, how are you?
Morning, David. Morning, Mark.
Good morning, Dwight.
For those of you who are not familiar with Mark, Mark's been in and around the world of HR for basically your entire career, right?
That's correct.
He started IA because he had worked with and for consulting firms and thought there's got to be a different way of working. And so Mark believes in helping amplify each and every client he supports by finding the right solution to the organization and then leaving, by providing them with just what they need to become self-sufficient and to go. Mark, it's just the way Turetsky Consulting likes to work. That's awesome.
That's fantastic. And I'll tell you guys, I mean, you know this because you're living this every day. This makes us the anti-consulting firms because, frankly, every other firm in the world is incented to penetrate and radiate, put their hooks and claws into a client and never leave. And it's really shocking, I think, to our clients. I'm sure you guys find this as well, that when you come in at the beginning with the notion of we are exiting and to whom can we knowledge transfer, tool transfer, and get you self-sufficient, it's a game changer. So we're glad to continue to support the same ethos.
And one of the funny things about that is that they are actually shocked. They say, hey, can we get another SOW? And we say, okay, are you sure? And, you know, that's our ethos as well. So we're going to stick with that. We like that, and we don't want to change.
Fantastic.
So for those of you who know Mark, one fun thing you may not know about Mark is he likes to gamble, and he's actually pretty good at it. Mark, you got to tell us why and how.
Oh my gosh! Well, good at gambling is kind of a relative term. I mean, this is a data conversation. So all the data would suggest that for everyone who wins, you know, there's many more people who lose. No. But one funny story: just a couple of years ago, I was with a client up in the Midwest. In this particular city I was in, they happened to have a little local casino. The client had an emergency that came up in the middle of a workshop, and they said, hey, Mark, we heard you like to gamble. Why don't you literally walk across town? And guys, I'm talking like 5 blocks, right? Walk across town, take a break, come back in like 2.5 hours, and we'll continue with our working session. So I hoof it. It's a beautiful day. I pop into some local casino I've never heard of. I just am magnetically drawn to the stupidest thing I could play, which is a slot machine. I put in, you know, I don't know, I probably put in like $100 like a moron, right? Put in $100. I hit a $25 play and I won $125,000 on that first spin. I won the big jackpot. What makes the story interesting is not that I won that, which was crazy, by the way. It was absolutely insane. But that literally on the way back to the client, after the bells went off and they took my photo inside, you know, couldn't cash the giant check, couldn't fit it in my suitcase back in the plane. But at the end of the day, 2 guys followed me when I left and tried to jump me to steal the check.
No way.
And all I'm thinking of, they didn't give me a suitcase full of cash. You know, this isn't an Ocean's movie. Like I'm literally just walking with a check. So, you know, I'll leave it with this. I still had the money and they got arrested. So, so at the end of the day, I guess everything comes with a price. But yes, I love to gamble. And it's been too long with COVID. I haven't gambled in like a year and a half.
Wow. So you're good at gambling and escaping.
Yes, apparently. It's hard to catch. As well.
Best consulting gig ever.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So the topic for today is dynamic organizations and the challenges that a company might face when it comes to teaming as well as analytics. Mark, this is near and dear to my heart because I've worked with many clients who've had many dynamic teams, whether it's consulting firms or investment banks. What is a dynamic organization in 2021?
Hey, this is William Tincup, and you should know about the You Should Know podcast. It's a topical, fun podcast with Ron, myself, and a guest, or guests, plural sometimes, and we tackle the most timely topics of the day. Give it a look, give it a listen, and subscribe. Thanks.
Yeah, and I love the question because what we're finding, and if we think about, even the work that we do or the work that we find our clients, employees, or people leaders do every single day, almost everything is truly dynamic. We even have manufacturers where when we start talking to them about dynamic teams, they're like, well, hang on, we have hourly workers that come in and work the line. It's like, but every line is dynamic, right? You're producing new products, new services. You need new skills, new capabilities, and new resources. And guys, where we tend to start is we start to step away from the notion of employee and we embrace all worker types. Because we're finding, I'm sure you do with your clients as well, that there's probably maybe a 30 to 150% population growth when you start to take into contingent and contract labor or temporary labor pools or seasonal labor pools. Mm-hmm. So part of it is we have to think about all the workers. We have to think about how all the workers are assembled. We have to think about how those workers are dynamically assessed for tested and verified skills. Then we have to think about how they're provisioned to produce some kind of work product. And then they're released, potentially reskilled, retrained, and reassembled. And it's happening constantly in every organization around the world. And even for those that occupy, let's say, a traditional supervisory hierarchy, their days are probably split in a way that maybe 30% is allocated to project A, 40% is allocated to really the job you were hired to do, and the remainder is maybe dynamically assigned to 3 or 4 other initiatives, products, or supporting requirements. And so the point is, our systems, our data, our infrastructure, our pay, our benefits are really ill-equipped to be able to manage the dynamic assembly, deployment, and reassembly of worker types for the provisioning of resources and for the outcomes of work, whatever that work may be. And so what we're finding is a lot of organizations are really questioning the whole hierarchy, the whole notion of what it means to be an employee. Right. We have one very large client, they have over 100,000 employees, that is saying, well, is everyone really a contingent worker, right? Putting aside regulatory and legislative concerns, is everybody really a contingent worker if we really think about how work is done? So the data story is foundational, and frankly, it's broken. We're not quite there yet.
But there's also another part, Mark, which goes back to corporate culture, right? It's how do you espouse the relationship between the employee and the organization? What is the value proposition to the employee? What's the value proposition to the organization of that bond between the employee and the organization? And when you start to question that, or when you start to change it, you upset some of especially the people who you consider to be permanent, quote unquote permanent, I'm using my air quotes, permanent, full-time employees. You start to question the foundations, and that kind of puts a rumble underneath their feet, right? It makes that transition or the communication very difficult of how do I change your relationship to the organization? I know that was a loaded question, but I guess at the end of it.
No, I don't think it's a loaded question, honestly, David. And I like the question because, frankly, if we go back to a pre-COVID world, we had this problem staring us in the face for all these worker types anyhow. So, I used to live in DC and work in DC, and we used to do a lot of work with government agencies. And one of the things that you noticed is there were different colored badges, right? Some were contractors, some might be consulting firms, and some would be those full-time federal employees. They were all sitting in the same rooms. They were all side by side in cubicles. They were all working on the same projects and initiatives. When the differentiation in that employer value proposition came into play is when there was, a beer after work, right? Or the organization decided to assemble something. But when we were on the ground, and we were all on the ground, in pre-COVID eras, This happened every single day. Those people that were the other, who were literally doing the same job, who were literally in the same facility, probably in the same cubicle block as their full-time employee peers, were excused from the promise of that employer value proposition. And one of the things, not to go on a mini rant, but one of the things that I'm challenged with EVPs and this employer promise is you have to be transparent, meaning, is this factual? Is it aspirational? Is it inspirational? Is it meant to be some combination therein? I was literally with a CHRO on Monday challenging her as she's putting her new people strategy. They're headquartered in Europe. And I said, well, your employees call bullshit on this. Well, they say at the end of the day that this is not factually the organization that I work for. And it's okay if it's not, as long as you declare your own self-awareness that this is who we'd like to be. And these are the actions that we're going to take to get there. So absolutely, I think there's a promise, maybe a false premise in some cases, in terms of how to hold the employer accountable for what they claim life is intended to be while working for the organization.
Now, I know you said, Mark, held everything equal, or you held everything equal, including regulation and laws. You can't do that, though, in the world of HR, because the value proposition leads to regulations, or the promise of value proposition to the employee leads to regulations, which has a direct impact to those two people sitting next to each other, one getting, one not getting, and the potential for litigation or the potential for, class action, like we've seen, Microsoft. But when Microsoft got sued for having contractors and employees doing the same job,
right,
but yet the contractors weren't getting the benefits and pay. They were being treated as employees, but they weren't getting paid like them. I think that was the example, and it happened, it feels like a long time ago now.
Yeah, and we see it with the gig workers as well, right? Mass litigation associated with the gig economy, with Uber and Lyft is probably the most prevalent example. So at what point is the legal manifestation of directing work, right, is directing one's work and controlling one's work move you into what certainly here in the States we would designate as a full-time equivalent?
Right.
And that's a problem that I think people are wrestling with. But not to pick on Uber, but Uber was a perfect example of how they advocated to frankly change the laws and created an economic incentive to do so. So we're talking about a long time horizon, but even if we set aside maybe the legal implications of everybody being a dynamic worker or everyone being a contingent worker, we're still acknowledging now with mobility that location, right, is no longer a barrier to being an effective knowledge worker, let's say.
Sure.
Certainly in manufacturing and certain retail hospitality, presenteeism is a core requirement.
Yep.
But as we're watching what's happening with the craziness in the housing market right now, people are fleeing. I left San Francisco. I left San Francisco a couple of years ago for Nashville, Tennessee. I'm about to leave Nashville, Tennessee and move to Atlanta here in about 6 to 8 weeks. So if you're a knowledge worker, you can frankly live anywhere. But if we think about data, right, will employers take the position of paying you where you live or paying you the value of the job, or dare I say jobs, right, plural, that you occupy?
Sure.
So when we look at market pay, right, I mean, just again, if we focus on one subdomain of HR, which is compensation, are the compensatory elements associated with market pay. And then we think about the merit process for compa ratios and let's say annual or targeted adjustments. Do we do it based on the roles that you're fractionally applied to? We do it on the job that you were hired into, which is frankly unrecognizable compared to the work you're actually doing every day.
Sure.
Or is there some hybrid therein? One of our very large tech clients is trying to figure that out right now. How do they do dynamic market pay?
Yeah.
And it's an incredibly complex algorithm. But again, if we center on our HCM systems as the system of record, again, we haven't seen a maturity model quite yet come forward from the major HCM systems to be able to support an employee record with this level of complexity.
One of the things that you touched on that really underscores that is the multinational corporations. And when you get into pay multinational, David knows this. I spent a good amount of my time in South America this past year and a half, and in Colombia specifically. And as part of that, the Colombian economy, average pay is probably about a quarter to a third of what the pay is here in the United States. So if somebody lives in Colombia, are you doing overall market-driven pay or are you doing country-specific pay? As you've touched on, there are a lot of layers to this, and each layer you have to peel back and push things forward again after you peel it back. So
Well, I think, I think, Dwight, that's actually giving rise to even more of the gig economy where there are resources available around the world. If you go to Fiverr or if you go to Upwork or if you go to some other places that give you the ability to get access to specific skills and specific types of people who can do things for you wherever they are, you'll see that you're paying similarly around the world for those types of activities focused on the skills that those people have. Obviously, that person who's in that market is getting the benefit of the place arbitrage, right? You're giving up control of the person, as Mark was saying, in the place that they need to be. Well, they don't really need to be there right now. So, but you're paying similarly. You may be paying less. In fact, most of the time you're paying less, but you're not paying substantially less like you used to, because people say, well, I don't need to charge $5 because the activity in the US, I can get 25 and I'm really good and I've got all these great reviews. So I can at least do 20 or 25 and someone will pay me that rate, because that's the going rate there.
I think, guys, you're dead on. I mean, Dwight, to your earlier point, we just finished an assignment for a large global manufacturer, and they have real issues with mobility, even cross-European mobility, right? Because of the statutory benefits that are offered in each of the countries in which they operate, because of the familial connection that one has in their locale of choice. You may have an opportunity in another local country, right? That's presumably within mobility distance for relocation, but the friction is too high to warrant that. And then, David, to your point, then, is it the value of the work or the value of the location? Because, I may buy that international resource at what would be a premium compared to their local valuation.
Exactly.
But in our valuation of the work product they're producing, it's still fractional. It's the same equivalent to what we're seeing in the housing market, right? Which is, frankly, I can take my millions of dollars from California, move to another low-cost locale. I'm getting more house for that. It's the same thing for comp. Like, we need to be paying people based on the value of their work, not necessarily based on where they're located. But it's very tricky for people to navigate on both sides, frankly. Yeah.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by Turetsky Consulting and listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
So, Mark, that actually translates to an issue that companies are going to have when they're dealing with dynamic teams, which is the data around the dynamic teams and some other struggles that they may face to actually have implementations of those dynamic teams in their organization. Can you kind of give us like your top 5 of what these struggles are? I think I kind of seeded one, which is data, but what are the other ones, or kind of explain what you think are those major struggles that they're going to have?
Yeah, I mean, struggle number one that we see is the relentless catalyst for change, right? Organizations can certainly try to establish a 3 or 5 year plan, but let's be honest, those don't sustain. We're seeing unprecedented C-suite turnover, right? The average tenure for a C-suite leader is now down to about 14 or 15 months. So the expectation is when a new leader arrives, I don't care what role you're occupying, you're there to foster change and to drive change in the organization. You are a catalyst or a trigger. We see a massive increase in M&A and divestiture activity, constant catalyst for change. We see a need to rationalize just within the 4 walls of HR and people communities, to rationalize the HR ecosystem, to develop deeper and fewer meaningful relationships to govern, which means our HR tech stack, right, is constantly changing and rationalizing. And there's almost a Darwinian consumption of the hierarchy of who owns the front door of the employee experience across talent acquisition, talent management, core HR, payroll, rewards, or any combination therein. And we see, frankly, that the populations are changing. People are either opting in and out of organizations at a higher frequency, or the categorization in which they occupy is changing. So I may have retired from organization A, but guess what? In 6 weeks, I came back as a part-time gig worker or as a contingent laborer. So do I really ever leave? Or I'm an alumnus, right? I'm going to go graduate, as it were, go get additional skills, and then come back in 2 and 3 years. So all of this means that everything is changing all the time. And one of the biggest issues that we find with employers right now, and I'll get to the data side because that's where we want to center for this conversation, is the prioritization. That HR is ill-equipped in most instances, frankly, to be able to ingest this quantity of change, to be able to demonstrate, frankly, prioritization, and to able to extract insight from the information, and God forbid, some level of predictive information, that allows us to inform the decisions that are the underpinning or outcomes of this dynamic infrastructure that we're describing. And I'll go back to the CHRO I spoke with earlier this week. I said, well, what's your key pain point? She's looking at, a global harmonization project for their 79,000 employees in 76 different countries. And she said, data. My biggest problem is data. I have no data that is accurate. I have 125 different HR systems that are touching my people across their life cycle in various geographies around the world, which is not unusual, frankly. How do I extract accurate information? Because let's say diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is a key care about. Back to your point, David, about what's our employee value proposition? How do we live up to what we're saying? Let's just focus on DEI and belonging for just a second. I don't even have accurate data, demographic data on the profiles of my employees. And are we losing disproportionately, females of color who are non-binary? She's like, I have no idea, because by the time I get the data is out of date and it's inaccurate. It's the age-old story of data integrity. So with so much change happening all the time, how can we center ourselves and ground ourselves on what is the core truth of the organization, which is foundationally built on data?
Right.
So that's really the number one thing that we're trying to advocate for, is we've got to start with data, and we've got to start with a common data repository or source that, frankly, we can have some level of trust and veracity behind. Go ahead, David.
Well, the thing I was going to say to that is that what we've been advocating for is data governance, which is having good definitions, having a really good understanding about what is the truth, what is the source of truth, where is the data coming from, what is its velocity, what's its veracity, where can you point to and say, that's where I'm going to do my reporting and analytics from, and feel confident about it. What we have to do a lot of times is step back at least one or two steps with a client before we can actually move forward, because they haven't taken that good hard look at their data to actually look at what the holes are first before they actually go and start running an analytics program, or even just trying to get good headcount data, or to solve a higher order problem like you were just talking about who's leaving and why are they leaving. They can't do that until they take a couple steps back. They look at the configuration of their system. They look at the configuration of their data. And Dwight just wrote a great blog, and we had a podcast about it a few weeks ago about data governance. And I think it really speaks to the fact that we actually got a really good reaction to it, that companies really do believe data is the foundation of understanding your organization.
I couldn't agree more. And Dwight, I'm looking forward to reading that post and amplifying it, because you're 100% correct. And part of this is HR needs to establish a firm and fixed point of view of their role in governing and managing data. And part of that is, are you intentional about a taxonomy? Like, do you have a global taxonomy that you can harmonize to? If you don't, whether you're aware of it or not, you're subscribing to others' taxonomies. And have you even deconstructed or self-discovered the fact that you are? And do you know what their data sources and data taxonomies are? So part of this is being, what we affectionately refer to as HR private investigators, right? If you don't know what you have, you can't possibly understand the undertaking of a good data governance model. You can't possibly understand the change management that will get you from current state to, dare I say, like an idealized future state. And then again, what's the roadmap and prioritization that's going to get us from where we are to where we want to be? And how do you not cede too much ground because of maybe a lack of discomfort, a lack of expertise, even a lack of storied and capable resources within the four walls of the people function? And how do we lease that talent, right, from either other parts of the organization that perhaps are a bit ahead? There's great examples within almost every industry, frankly, where data is at the center of every experience for every business. I think that's, almost table stakes today, certainly. Sure. So HR is behind, and we have to have a fixed and firm point of view. But that means resourcing. That means stopping something else. And this is the hardest part, right? That means stopping something else and creating both operating and capital funding, and creating resourcing, full-time and part-time recs, to be able to explicitly focus on this problem, to separate signal from noise. So, Dwight, thanks for your advocacy in the market. I think it's well needed.
Yeah, most definitely. I appreciate that. And one of the other major challenges that I've seen is the cultural aspect of siloing within organizations. And if you want to look at data governance, you have to break down those silos somehow. And when you've got such a cultural underpinning that perpetuates that siloing, it makes that job so much more difficult, along with the fact that the concepts of data governance and data quality for people are sort of there in the back of their minds, but getting them to wrap their heads around the need for a data governance program is also a difficult barrier for getting through that. And so, like you talked about with HR data, the organization needs to really give the value equation of where HR fits into this, and then move on to how do we break down those silos so that we can get the data governance, we can start to build those data warehouses or data lakes or whatever the aggregation mechanism might be, so that you can start to use that data on an ongoing basis. But definitely a lot of difficult elements that go into all of those pieces.
Yeah, and Dwight, building on that, I mean, I'm not sure if you guys see this with your clients. We certainly see this at times, understandably so. You can't outsource the accountability for this to your third-party providers, because your third-party providers certainly have a point of view. To the extent that their point of view and their established framework and taxonomy and approaches are aligned to your particular outcomes, fantastic, right? But any organization of any strength will say, well, what are you trying to achieve? What are the outcomes? So we're big advocates, guys, also for really driving specific use cases, because I think at times it's difficult for certain leaders in these organizations to get their minds around how this data will actually be brought to life in the flow of work and in making, frankly, really key and critical and strategic decisions. So by bringing use cases forward, which we would collaborate to develop in partnership with our clients, we can then bring the best value propositions of those third-party providers forward, because it's got to start with the what, and then the providers can bring forward the how. But I see a lot of temptation to sort of outsource as much of that accountability to third parties as possible, when frankly the employer can't cede that much ground. I'd be curious, David, Dwight, what you guys are seeing as well.
I would like to think that organizations have centers inside their organization that they could tap, like you were saying before, who have had these experiences in the past, whether it's sales, whether it's marketing, whether it's in their IT organization, have champions in the IT organization that HR could borrow and be able to bring to bear, or at least be able to help them see some of the issues and be able to focus on them, so that they don't have to borrow resources from outside the organization. And so everything is kept inside the four walls of the company. But like you were saying before, though, sometimes we need to look outside. We need to buy or borrow some kind of taxonomy or some kind of capability and then own it, and then bring it in and make sure that it's going to be yours and make it yours. Companies like MZ or Salary.com have done a pretty good job of being able to provide things like open source or for sale taxonomies that companies can use and then build on them in their own organizations to be able to make them theirs. So I'm hoping that it's a combination of the two, and that the organizations can then build on that, get at least some little win, like being able to fix a job table, and then work on getting incrementally better from there. But I don't know. What do you think, Dwight?
No, I totally agree. You have to have some sort of framework, and oftentimes that does come from the outside. And if you can use that, and then, Mark, to your point, really having good champions within the organization. And that's always the challenge, because for a number of reasons, getting somebody to agree to it, number one. Number two, they get into it and figure out that they're taking daggers from all of their colleagues, and it gets to be a tough job being the champion. But if you can get that and you can get some traction, you're going to have good results. I've seen in a number of systems implementations, and I've seen both scenarios take place, where a lot of the failed system implementations relied on that third-party outsider to have the accountability for all of those pieces, the data governance pieces and the rollout and everything. Just sort of brought them in and said, go, and they just weren't able to do it because they weren't part of the cultural framework of the organizations. And the successes that I've seen have been those scenarios that you just talked about, Mark, where there's internal accountability and you have strong champions in place to really push things forward. that to me is going to be the big difference between, are you going to be successful in the HR data space, or is this not going to work the way that we want it to?
Yeah, and part of this, guys, I would think is also, frankly, a little bit of marketing and salesmanship, as it were. The operating businesses that we're supporting, they're not going to wait for HR. If they have a problem with, how do they provision the right resources to open 150 new stores for a retailer, or stand up, 87 new hotels for a hospitality provider, or open 14 new manufacturing plants for, a new manufacturing set of clients that they've run around the world, the operating units are going to figure it out, right? They're going to get after it. They're left to their own devices. They're going to find local talent. They're going to provision and acquisition if necessary, and they're going to move forward. So part of this is we need to stop marketing this almost as an HR data problem. This is a business data problem, right? And,
absolutely.
And if we can equate that the business is inextricably linked to both tooling and to resources and workers, then so be it. And one of the more fascinating conversations I had last year, because we were focused a lot on this, what we were calling the war for skills coming out of 2020. We did a lot of research around this sort of global skills taxonomy and some of the bellwether research coming out of the World Economic Forum and others, is the fact that we haven't thought about technology in a skills taxonomy, meaning what skills do our robotics, AI, and machine learning tools and capabilities have? What skills are they developing? And what skills remain and need to be developed for our human workers, right, as we continue to evolve? And I'm not an economist, and certainly everything would say that, yes, we're creating new jobs and new requirements, and that's certainly true. But the amount of displacement that I'm seeing for jobs that will frankly never come back, and the speed, and to use a term you mentioned earlier, David, velocity, the velocity with which we're seeing now the infusion of technology, certainly as an accelerant to outcomes for replicable skills, it's coming faster and more materially than I think ever before. What we're not seeing, although the expectation is 50% of reskilling will be put on the shoulders of corporations, we're not seeing the reskilling happening fast enough. And we're not seeing centers of ownership, either within or outside of organizations, to say, wow, we're going to have a real crisis on our hands with the velocity with which technology will displace skilled workers and skilled resourcing.
So fascinating topic. And we could probably spend an entire podcast on it, because we've had these conversations, and Chris Havrilla, who I love from Deloitte, one of my best friends, we had a great conversation with her about this. And one of the things I think that's come up, Mark, is that when you start treating all of these resources that are providing value as workers, whether it's an AI, whether it's a robot, whether it's a person, that's where our HR systems need to get to and be able to, not just skills, because skills are building blocks to jobs that are building blocks to output, right? The equation's still there. It's still the same. It's just there are different actors now who are actually doing it. And to your point, there's even a new equation because the work has changed completely. In some ways, it's not the same output. It's not y equals mx plus b anymore. The equation's a little different because there's now new x's, and the resulting y is a little more complex than it used to be. Some's offline, some's online, some's physical, some's electronic. So we could definitely get into it, and I would probably welcome you back for that as well in a different podcast. So I wanted to kind of end this segment by saying, it's an incredible question. And I think to wrap this part up, Mark, we're going to have to figure out, how do our HR systems and all the other systems, whether it's GL, whether it's ERP, how can they work together in a next generation of thinking without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Because we can't do that. We have to have an operational set of systems to keep us going. How do they evolve to get us to be able to have that foundational set of data to make business decisions, not HR decisions? It's not about HR anymore. It's about R. It's just about resources. How do we change to get to the R?
Yeah, and let me take that on, and I'll start with the beginning, which is talent acquisition. So if we think about foundationally how talent acquisition works, right? We put together a job requisition, we put together desired and attested qualifications and skills that were required. And if I were offering David, Dwight, you guys career coaching, and you said, wow, I saw this great opportunity at my dream job, what would I recommend you do? Well, first, inventory everything you've ever done, right? Quantify every outcome you've ever created. narrowcast your resume and your application, take the collective wisdom that you've had in your entire career and winnow that down using the same language and the same skills and qualifications that are on that requisition, and make sure that those two are inextricably linked. So by virtue of the best career advice that any coach would give to any individual today, the idea is I'm taking a fraction of who I am, and I'm taking that fraction of who I am, and I'm connecting that to the requisition that's posted to increase the likelihood of the technology matching me, right? Because let's face it, right? The algorithm needs to rank and rate me based on the information that I've provided. The challenge right now then, and I go back, David, to where you started in our conversation about this promise of what it means to work for these organizations, right? The promise that we hear and that we bandy about within the people function is I want to see the whole David. I want to see the whole Dwight, right? I want to see the whole person. Well, by virtue of the application process, we're starting with imperfect data about our people at the outset. And very few organizations, frankly, have been super intentional about once you've gone through that funnel, and let's say I've made you an offer and now you're in pre-boarding or onboarding, how do I get the rest of you into my systems, right? The fields exist, right? If we go to the employee record, the fields certainly exist. But what incentive do I now have to expose all my Davidness and Dwightness, right, to the organization so that they know I speak 4 languages, or Dwight, right? I've worked in South America for 18 months. And, I speak Portuguese so the moment that an opportunity comes up, I can actually search into that data. I mean, these are the dream use cases, right? Is that we see the whole person is represented in the data. It's not just limited to the role I occupy. And as I develop skills and as projects that I complete and as performance reviews come in, that I create data portability, that all this data is visible. But then we have all these political movements in organizations which are around restricting people, right? David, you're on my team. Dwight, you're on my project. I'm not going to lose you. I don't want to incent you to raise your hand and expose your fullness of who you are because I don't want somebody to find you in the system. The questions we get when we talk about these use cases, guys, is, well, hold on a second. So wait, who can search on this data? Any manager in any location can search on this because we have the skills internally. And I'll tell you guys just a quick story on this. In the heart of COVID, we had a client, a chief people officer out of LA hospital system, who could not get background checks back, right? The counties weren't responding. The universities weren't responding. This was probably June of last year. And they had different workers that had been dispositioned outside of the organization or to part-time work. So what they realized is, wow, we might have all the skills we need for these 400 jobs we're trying to fill within the people we already know. So they asked all their people to tell us about all their certifications and all the skills that we never, frankly, asked you about before. And guess what they did? They filled all 400 positions with people they already had. Right? So the point is, we know nothing. We are fractionally aware of the skills and the capability and the data around the people we already have. And so if we stop the protectionism, we're more intentional about seeing the whole person, which we espouse, right, as a function, and we create the data library so people know, frankly, what terms to use. Back to your foundational advice from the last segment, guys. Then we know that, wow, great talent already exists. The project that David just completed, right, means he just has a verified skill or a verified outcome that his performance would suggest through continuous conversations is the level of validation we're looking for. That means he's ready for the next project. And again, it's self-perpetuating, guys. Yeah.
So, Mark, we talked about dynamic teams and we talked about the dynamicism of an organization in 2021. We talked about a lot of the challenges that HR is going to face around data and how they're actually going to have to face those challenges and be able to come up with solutions that they're going to have to look across the organization to help solve. And then we talked about some of the ways in which we can get started with it, or at least some of the things we're going to have to face. Mark, is there anything else that you wanted to bring up before we close?
The only thing I'd say, guys, and thank you for the time today, is you have to have a point of view. So I would say do not cede this well-fought ground of HR being in the spotlight to the rest of the organization. Establish a firm and fixed point of view and just get started. get started with something. Pick a use case, an outcome, a particular strategic initiative, a key care about that you can build some momentum and muscle, and then grow that momentum and muscle through success, iterative success, and demonstrable success with your organization writ large. But it all starts with being intentional. If we're not intentional, as we all know, about anything, nothing's ever going to get done organically.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure to see you today.
And thank you for listening to the HR Data Labs podcast. If you like this episode, please hit subscribe. If you know somebody who might find this episode interesting, please send it their way. And if you have any comments, please go to the turetskyconsulting.com/podcast page and leave us your thoughts. Thank you very much. Take care and stay safe.
That was HR Data Labs. Please visit turetskyconsulting.com/podcast to review the show, add comments about this episode, or add new ideas about upcoming shows you'd like to hear. Feel free to be creative, but please be nice. Thank you for joining us this week on the HR Data Labs podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.